Welcome to Antique Sprinklers. Today we're going to be taking a look at the last series of Buckner brass cam rotors that were manufactured. And more specifically, we're going to be looking at the versions of those that were meant for athletic fields and play areas. So a lot of you will remember that a few years ago we did a complete history of the Buckner Cam rotor from its development in the 1920s through its being discontinued almost 80 years later. And if I remember, I'll include a link to that more lengthy video at the end of this one. But today we're talking specifically about the 1300 series of cam rotors and those that had a rubber cover. First, to set these sprinklers in time, these brass cam rotors, the 1300 series, were introduced in the early 1960s. William A. Buckner had passed away in the early 1950s. And his widow, Mona Buckner, and his business partner, Harry Cleason, had sold their halves of the company in 1958 and 1962, respectively, to a businessman from Los Angeles named James Cosin. At roughly the same time that Cosin was taking over the business, Buckner introduced a new cam rotor. It was one that had a one-piece body rather than the two-piece versions that came before it, and also from the very smallest 3/4 inch size up through the massive 1.5 inch size, they kept the same design for the lower and upper cams and the spindles and the nozzles, the actual sprinkler body, if you will, through every single size. So if you take a look at this little guy here, this is a 3/4 inch 1310. And it might be hard to see, I'll have some pictures of it, but this is a lower cam. And then you have the body assembly, the spindle, and captive to it is the upper cam, and there's some washers in there to keep water from going everywhere. And then these dual nozzles, and the inner nozzle has that very classic slot in the top that creates the rooster tail, and there's even a little hole in the lid to facilitate that. And so you can imagine this is the size of the cam for the little guy, and it's actually the same size as is in this little 1300. And then, you know, through each progressive size up, the cam gets bigger and bigger. So by the time you get to that 1.5 inch cam rotor, it's probably about this size. But the important thing is, conceptually, it's the same sprinkler, just bigger at every stage. And so to get into the sprinklers a little bit, right here, we have the 1300, and this is a quarter circle version. And back then, for these little rotors, they would just block the stream where they didn't want it to go. So the opening here, it only covers 1/4 of a circle. And it was meant to cover about 25 feet. And the application for that was residential or commercial lawns. And it did have, you'll see this has the plastic top on it. It did have an option for a rubber cover. I've never seen one of these with a rubber cover on it. They're incredibly rare. But they did have that, and it was great for children's play areas. Moving up from that size, we have the 1310. And the 1310 was meant to have about a 35-foot radius. So again, it's the more commercial version of the 1300 as a slightly longer radius. You're probably not going to put this on a playing field because you'd just end up with so many sprinklers out there. But if you had an application where you didn't have a really great water supply, there wasn't a lot of flow available, it might be an option for that kind of thing. And of course it has, you know, the standard rubber cover that all the next sizes up had as an option as well. Moving up from that, we have the 1330 that was meant to cover about a 35 to 55 foot radius, depending on the nozzle that you put in it and the pressure that it was operating at. And now you're getting into an area where you might actually use these on an athletic field, or maybe on a small tee complex or something like that on a golf course. It's getting to that place where you could probably get away with the biggest nozzle with like a 60-foot square spacing, maybe a 70-foot triangular spacing. So you're getting into some bigger applications with this guy. Or if somebody has a heck of a huge yard, this would cover a lot of lawn at once. And then you have the guy that I was most familiar with, and this is the 1360, or technically the 1360R. All of these should have an R after their model number. Or when you were ordering them from the factory, you would have the complete model number, which after the Royal Coach buyout would have been 11360-06, and the 06 designated that it needed to have this rubber cover. And so this 1360 was meant to cover a 45 to 60 foot radius And you could stretch that spacing way out on it because of the way the inner nozzle watered. And this was one that I put on a lot of like practice fields, field hockey fields, really any kind of a rectangular, wide open turf space that didn't have a track or other obstructions around it. So full circle sprinklers that just, kept the scallop way off in sort of the out of bounds region of it was adequate. And it was a nice, inexpensive way to design a system. Typically, say on a football practice field, I'd use a 60-foot square spacing and have anywhere from 2 to 4 of these coming on a single zone. The more zones, the more control you have over the different turf conditions across the field. And we got creative in some of those designs where maybe you would pipe sprinklers in the center of the field together and those on the sidelines together because they had different watering requirements. Or in the case of soccer, you'd pipe the ones in front of the goals differently than the ones on the sideline. So anywhere there was heavy wear areas, you would do that in those applications. And then also in golf. And, with some of the bigger nozzles they had, you could use these on greens, on tees, and they performed very, very well. So what's missing from the table? First of all, the 1300 came in a full circle, third of a circle, and half circle version. The third of the circle might have been a special order. And all I have here is the quarter circle. Late in its life, they'd gotten down to just having the full and the half circle version of these. And then, I have every size up from that, 1310, 1330, 1360. But they also made a 1370 and a 1371 that had an 1.25 inch inlet instead of the 1-inch inlet that these guys have. And I've never been able to designate what the difference between the 71 and the 70 is, but sometime around 1969, 1970, they changed the model number, and I've just never been sure why. And then they had the granddaddy. They had the 1390, and where the 1370 might cover a 60 to 85 foot radius. The 1390 was more of that 80 to 108 foot radius. And so you would see 1390s used primarily on fairways, on golf courses. My buddy Kerry out in San Diego tells me that he saw them operating at Balboa Park in San Diego. They must have had massive turf areas to be able to accommodate those things. I've never seen a 1370 or a 1390 in person. It is on my bucket list of sprinklers I hope to get someday. But basically, they are these sprinklers, but just bigger. So there's really, really no difference. They do put like a breakup on the inner nozzle as opposed to having the slot in it. So that is one difference, I guess. But otherwise, they're the same. So I'm not sure you'll be able to see it, but I'll also put up pictures of these things. The way these sprinklers rotate is there's a motor core in the middle of the inlet. And it's the same for every single size of these guys, just different sizes. And it serves two functions. The first function is to get the water spinning. And then the second function is to control the amount of water that goes straight up through the sprinkler. And it's through that means that you control the speed of rotation. So there's two ways to do that. One is, before the sprinkler's in the ground, there's a slotted screw in the bottom of this motor core. And if you turn that in, then you'll speed up the speed of rotation. If you back it out, you'll slow it down. If you take the internals out, like I have on this 1310, there's also a slot for that same screw that you can access through the top. And in that case, if you turn it clockwise, I guess that is, you're slowing down the sprinkler, and counterclockwise, you're speeding up. So it's the exact opposite as if you were doing it from below. Neither way is super convenient. It's a great feature, but not something you're going to adjust much after they're installed in the field unless you really have a problem. And really the issue that you run into, other than a nice slow rotation speed is a nice way to apply water in most cases, unless you're trying to do a syringe or something. The primary issue is the faster the sprinkler spins, the more you're likely to whip the spray of the nozzles and shorten the effective radius covered, and also screw up the distribution pattern of the sprinkler as well. And that's not something you want to do. So these guys would last a decade or more. And there's stories of some, when I was in irrigation in the second half of the 80s and through the 90s, of some of these that were installed in the 60s and they were just getting around to changing the cams, or in the 70s. That wasn't always the case. So in the early 1990s, somehow the formula for making these cams was altered. And I remember I had a golf course that had a ton of cams on it. And instead of lasting a decade, they lasted about a month. And when the sprinklers stopped turning, we took them apart and looked, and the cams were completely flat. And this might be a good moment to explain how these things work, because you see, the cams have flat edges on the upper cam and on the lower cam. And so it'd be normal to think, oh, they catch each other and then lock and rotate. That's not what's happening. They actually rotate like this and spin off each other. And that way you get a controlled slow rotation speed out of it. But all of that, like bumping into each other and rubbing, will eventually rub these things flat. And like I said, it was happening in about 30 days instead of, 120 months. So needless to say, people were upset. And back at the factory, they took some samples back that we gave them from the field, and they could not figure out what was wrong. They knew it was the hardness that was off, but they didn't know the formula. Somehow that had been lost over the ages. Don't ask me how. That seems incredibly irresponsible to me. However, it happened. And the neat part of the story is a friend of mine who worked at Buckner got in touch with a guy who still lived in Fresno. He was about 92, 93 years old. His name is John Royer, and he has some of the patents for the Buckner rocker jet and other sprinklers from the like the 40s and 50s. And he remembered that to get these cams to be the right degree of malleable, machinable, and still hard enough to hold up, they needed to have 12% aluminum in them. And so when they switched to that formula, all the problems were behind them, not behind me. I spent a ton of time on golf courses and athletic fields with a screwdriver, sitting down next to sprinklers and changing out the cams on them, frequently in front of less than happy customers. So that was quite a learning experience for a really young guy. In a way, I'm glad I went through it. In another way, it would have been much better for us if it had never happened. It's hard to recover your reputation from those kinds of product failures, but the good thing is we stood behind it, and so did Buckner, and just shipped a ton of parts anywhere they needed to go, and we got through it. But it was a lesson in forgetting the old secrets of a sprinkler that at that time had been in production. Gosh, 60 years or so. The examples I'm going to show running next have never been installed, and they all work very well. The sound you're going to hear is louder than it is when they're installed because the ground muffles it quite a bit. And I don't have the two biggest, but you can imagine, how just the ringing that would come from like one of those big 1.5" 1390s, and with it popped up, this top body part on those things is like a gigantic bell held upside down, and the huge cams clacking off of each other. It would have made a heck of a racket. In the ground, they do make a pretty cool noise, but you can stand next to it. Above ground, you probably wouldn't want 20 of these things running at the same time. You wouldn't be able to hear yourself think. So that's what I have for you today on this final series of cam rotors that Buckner ever made. They are my favorite underground sprinkler, and I hope you enjoy watching them in action. Thank you.